And then during the 90s, we realized that we need to look more at emergent literacy and beginning reading, and we really focused on that. And there wasn't a lot that went on in comprehension, although we were still sort of energized by the work of the center. And then I started revisiting a wonderful cognitive psychologist by the name of John Bransford, and his book, How People Learn, which is one of my Bibles. And he had 3 principles. The first principle is, and again, I have this on the handout for you. Students come to the classroom with preconceptions about how the world works. By the way, I like the term preconceptions. I think it's a better term than prior knowledge. Because when you say prior knowledge, it suggests it's what kids know. And it sort of implies a correctness about it to me. Do you follow what I'm saying? But kids come to class and they know things, and they think they know things when they don't, okay? And they don't think they don't know things when they do. And they know some things halfway and some things 1/3 way. And I still use out of habit prior knowledge. But I like the term preconception because I think it encapsulates a little better what we're talking. If their initial understanding is not engaged, they may fail to grasp the new concepts and information that are taught, or they may learn them for the purpose of a test but revert to their preconceptions outside the classroom. I think it's a very powerful statement. In other words, we've got to begin with what do you already know, what you think, and so on. And we've done a lot of that kind of work here at Oakland University. But there's something else that Bransford's talking about. He's talking about long-term effects. In other words, the measure of learning is how much of that sticks. And how much of that kids remember 6 months later. Some of it's worth forgetting, by the way, but a lot of it is not. And how often as teachers we say, well, I thought I taught that last month, or I thought kids knew that, and they did, but then it went away. So we need to look at, there's some dissertations there too, by the way. His second principle, to develop a competence in an area of inquiry, students must have a deep foundation of factual knowledge. Understand facts and ideas in the context of a conceptual framework. In other words, they're just not ideas, they're sort of linked together in some way. And organize knowledge in ways that facilitate retrieval and application. I can use this information. And so there's a wonderful quote that says, in effect, issues that are studied deeply make other issues more accessible. In other words, sometimes our curriculum is sort of a mile wide and an inch deep. And we have to learn how to pick out those things that we're going to delve deeply into, and so on. Kids must have that experience. And 3, there's that metacognition popping up again. Now, Bransford was not a part of the center, but he was doing excellent work at Vanderbilt University. I think he's still out in California, although I believe he's reached. A metacognitive approach to instruction can help students learn to take control of their own learning by defining learning goals and monitoring progress. I think those principles can sort of drive us, and we can develop curriculum and methodology out of that, and so on. Well, that sort of gives us some of the theory, and I shared that with you because, you know, that email we got saying, I had a doctoral program and I graduated and I didn't know any of that stuff, which surprises me. But anyway, so let's look at a little bit of instructional practice. And this was the part that I was going to kick out. And Joan said, oh, no, you can't take that out. So if you don't like it, it's my wife's fault. And so let's go back 70 years. Classic book, Foundations of Reading Instruction by Emmett Betts. And Betts first put together something called the directed reading activity. And he said, look, we need some sort of system here, some sort of framework. So the first thing we need to do, we need to get kids ready to read. And we need to ensure adequate background. See, he understood the importance of background. We need to develop working concepts. That's sort of the vocabulary that's before the lesson. We need to stimulate interest somehow, and we need to identify a motive or purpose for reading. And then we're going to do a silent reading. And then we're going to come back and develop, this is right out of his book, we're going to develop word recognition skills and comprehension. Usually that was that Think and Do workbook that went along with Basel readers at that time. And we went into those activities. And then we go back and reread that story orally, you know, maybe round robin or whatever. And then you do follow-up activities. You know, if you've got a book about airplanes, then maybe you'd build airplanes or model airplanes, or maybe you'd look up airports or do something like that. Well, Betts had a student by the name of Russell Stauffer. And Stauffer left Temple University, where he was a student, and came to the University of Delaware. And in 1969, and Ron and I had been there several years, and he was working on this huge book, and he wrote a book called Teaching Reading as a Thinking Process. Okay, that was fair. I wouldn't say it was radical, but it was outside of the mainstream. Think about reading as thinking. And he developed the DRTA. And the DRTA says, in effect, that you just don't want to build prior knowledge, you want to access prior knowledge. And he began to introduce in a major way the concept of prediction. Now, I know it had been used before, but Stauffer really institutionalized it in that predicting what's going to happen next in your story and so on. He thought that we were wasting too much time getting kids ready to read. He believed in pupil purposes. Instead of saying to students, read to find out, he would turn that around and say to the students, based on what we've talked about, what are you going to be reading to find out? In other words, purposes became the students. Now, a lot of people in the profession misunderstood, and they said, well, they're basically the same. They're not the same. One is a telling process, I'm being simplistic here, and one is a querying process or an asking process. Psychologically, they're very, very different. Well, Stauffer had a passion for critical thinking. If you look at his book, his opening statement in his book, and Ron has one of those books in his office. I have mine too, but I had so much stuff in my suitcase that it wouldn't fit. This is the opening to his book. First page. Look what he writes. I have found the answer to my question, and I can read the line that proves it, said a 6-year-old first grader rising to her feet. The warmth and eagerness with which she spoke reflected the passion of the scholar who has achieved. In other words, he thought of first graders as scholars, as thinkers. This 6-year-old girl was taking a major step toward achieving reading maturity. That's the opening of his book, okay? So he had a passion for this. And he was very critical of some of the practices of the time. And this is also in the book a few pages later, where he looks at a lesson. Our story today, the teacher says, our story today is about a hungry mother lion and 2 hungry cubs. They are searching for food in the jungle. Look at the picture to tell what they found. Do you think the berries will be a treat for the lions? The first part of the story tells that they also found juicy bugs. Let's look at the next picture. What has the mother lion found? Read the story to find it. That was sort of the typical methodology of the day. And Stauffer weighs in, okay? And he says, why explain all of this to the children? Why tell the children this much about the story? What kind of children is this pablum intended for? What kind of children? Now, you know what pablum is? Mm-hmm. It's sort of tasteless gruel. It's tasteless like oatmeal kind of thing. I don't know whether they still say. Are teachers this incompetent? Can't the children for whom this is intended think? Okay. Can't the teachers for whom this is intended teach? Now, he waded right in there and was critical of his colleagues and teachers. And by the way, he's a great advocate for classroom teachers, no question about it. But he had problems with telling kids so much of the story before they begin reading. Now, interesting, if you look at some of the teachers' manuals today, what do you see? Much of the same kind of thing. Much of the same kind of thing. Anyway, that was Stauffer. And then, along came KWL and reciprocal teaching, and much of that was a response to the Durkin study. Remember, Durkin said we weren't teaching comprehension, and Donna Ogle and Taffy Raphael and Anne-Marie Palaskar went out and developed some new strategies and so on for comprehension. And then I put this slide in. I couldn't resist it. This was a time, a real sea change, and the emergence of writing. And Ron Kramer was very involved in this. His dissertation was on spelling, invented spelling, by the way. The recognition that young children should and could write. And nobody was a greater advocate of that than the father of the department here, a fellow named Harry Hahn. Harry Hahn had writing courses all over southeastern Michigan called Language Encounters, where kids wrote and so on. And the notion is that kids could write and let them spell as best they can, that the focus was on the content, the focus was on the thinking. Now, you couldn't have done that 15 years before, because 15 years before, and even at that time, this was a radical idea, because we were still under the umbrella of behaviorism, you see. And behaviorism said if a child made an error, what you had to do? You had to extinguish it immediately, and you had to give immediate feedback. Go look at some of those texts in 1960s and 70s. And so some people said, wait a minute. And we were becoming cognitivist. And we began to allow kids to write and spell. Some people today still have problems with that idea, but the research is pretty convincing. Focus on early writers. And then along came a guy by the name of Donald Graves. You all recognize that name. Writing Teachers and Children at Work, who said, look, not only can first and second grade kids write, but they can revise. And they can change their writing. And he changed how we thought about the writing process. And then we had kids doing a lot of writing all over the country, but particularly in southeastern Michigan. And Oakland University was, I believe, the first university to have a young authors conference. And usually during the spring semester, when the students weren't here, buses would come to this campus literally by the scores. And they would drop off kids. Remember, Liz? You're too young to remember. But they'd drop off kids, and the kids would sit around in groups and share their stories that they had written. And then we'd have somebody like Bill Martin or Leland Jacobs or somebody to come in and talk to the kids and so on. But it was called the Young Authors Conference. It started here at Oakland University. And we recognized the power of writing.